The topic for today is really Ben Witherington's book, What Have They Done with Jesus, and another presentation he made in 2006 to the Society of Biblical Literature, which are a group of Bible scholars. And Ben Witherington is indeed a Bible scholar. Uh, Witherington is a fascinating guy. He is a professor at Asbury Theological Seminary in Kentucky. He's done an awful lot. He's also got affiliation with St. Andrews and Durham University in England. He's a prolific author. And I highlight on the slide here two of which are particularly relevant to our topic. One is a book he wrote in 1995 on the Gospel according to John. Really a good book. I recommend it. But his thinking changed a lot between 1995 and 2006. The book that we recommended you get is What Have They Done with Jesus in 2006, and he's got two chapters particular to Lazarus. But let me just give a plug for the rest of the book. The rest of it is fascinating. It really is fascinating. He gets into topics like some of the women in the New Testament who get a little bit of short shrift in the text itself. But when you really dig, they were some truly significant women leaders of the early church and disciples of Jesus, besides just Mary Magdalene, who most people know about, but folks like Joanna. And he's got some chapters in there that are just spectacular on that, as well as an awful lot on James, Jesus's brother, which I found fascinating. Jude, Jesus's brother. A lot on Paul and Peter and Mary, mother of Jesus. So it's a good book, really a good book. And he is one of these scholars that just blow my mind, fluent in basically all the ancient languages, Hebrew, Greek, various forms of Greek, Latin, and he has spent a tremendous amount of time in the Holy Land and other areas where the early church was formed, doing just a tremendous amount of work. And he's a frequent commentator, as the slide here says. And here are his principal areas of expertise. Like I said, women in the New Testament. Johannan, he's a real John scholar. James Ossuary, that's James, brother of Jesus, and where his body was entombed. And just he's a fascinating guy, absolutely fascinating guy. Given the focus on AI in religion, I actually checked with ChatGPT what it has to say about Ben Witherington, and here's what it says. He's one of the leading figures in New Testament studies. James, I also got focused on Ben Witherington in part from James Martin's book, Come Forth. James Martin cites Ben Witherington as probably the leading person who's explored Lazarus, a person in terms of being a true biblical scholar. Martin describes him as the highest profile scholar who's taken the position about Lazarus. And yesterday I watched a YouTube presentation by James Martin on his book Come Forth, and he quoted Witherington just all throughout. So he is a real source and was one of the true inspirations for James Martin writing just the wonderful book Come Forth. And here's what Martin says to say about the book. What have they done with Jesus? Particularly clear and lucid, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So let me open it up. We recommend take a look at this book, at least those two chapters, and his presentation. And an awful lot of it should sound familiar, but there's some things we really haven't talked about before. And let me open up in any particular reactions from anybody as to things that they were struck by as they took a look at these materials.
Ben,
Yeah,
it's
Barbara.
Barbara. I can't see everybody, so I don't know if I'm jumping on top of someone's raised hand. So I apologize if I am. Um, I I find this book really fascinating for all the reasons you said. And two things. One, it occurred to me that as you and Doyd are talking to Ben Witherington, it would be super interesting if well, two things. You asked where do we go next? One, I think, would be to do a study of the Gospel of John, and the letters of John. Because I think what I found really fascinating about this Witherington's study was that he suggested not that, as we've sometimes heard, in shorthand, that Lazarus wrote the Gospel of John, but that Lazarus was the primary source, and that it was another John who wrote, John of Patmos, who wrote it based on that source. And the closest thing we get to a real letter um, from Lazarus is the shortest letter of the letters of John. And it's just super interesting. And it would be a wonderful way of putting everything that we've talked about with Lazarus in context, and to see the real import of, why it matters to know that he was the beloved disciple if we looked at it in the context of John. Um, so that would be super interesting. Either, something we do at Epiphany, maybe we, link it to the ongoing Friday morning Bible study that Doit and Kate lead. I know you've been part of. Or maybe we ask Witherington to, speak to the gospel, while he's here. And it looks like from your list that he's actually done, scholarship on that. The other thing that was interesting, just reading, I recommend the book to everybody because it gives you really interesting kind of, light shafts of light into the Gospels, reading the entire book. And one that I thought was so fascinating was the look at Joanna, who was a disciple of Jesus, maybe not one of the 12, but clearly was helping to fund the movement, followed him at significant risk to herself and her husband, who worked for Herod. Um, and then later, she emerges as Junius, as a follower of Paul,
Yep.
with a different husband, right? For probably obvious reasons. Um, and I just thought that was completely fascinating. I mean, I'd never put those things together before, that Joanna was the Hebrew form of Junius. Um, so, there are lots of little nuggets like that that really bring the Gospels alive in a really interesting way.
Yeah, Barbara, I had never really focused on Joanna before, and
Yeah,
I read that that blew my mind.
yeah,
Uh, Witherington's dissertation when he was in seminary was on women in the New Testament,
really.
so that's one of his real areas of expertise. Dwight and I kicked around the idea of if we do arrange it, it's still in the process, but if we do arrange for him to come out for the Feast of St. Lazarus, we have a service on that Saturday, which is the day, the Feast of St. Lazarus Day,
Mm.
and he would preach, and that's and probably presumably on Lazarus because it is the Feast of St. Lazarus, uh, and it's a full service. And then on the Sunday forum, we were thinking maybe he talk about Joanna or some of the other women
Mm, yeah.
in the New Testament. Uh,
Well, there's
it's
such
a,
a beautiful
I'm getting
continuity
off
in that
topic here, but
story.
geez, yeah, there's a theory that the Mary in the Lazarus story was actually Mary Magdalene.
Yeah.
Uh, there are a couple of scholars who explore that, not Witherington as much, but there's a couple other scholars. But I do think that there's an awful lot that women did in the New Testament that didn't get prominence in the New Testament, in part because of the ethic that existed at the time. And he's really dug down into a lot of that fascinating stuff.
Well, and he shows where it is in plain script. I mean, a lot of times our mothers were right, right? We only hear what we want to hear.
Yeah.
And cognitive linguists now bear this out. You take in the information that comports with your worldview, and you pretty much don't hear anything else. So, I mean, I remember as a little girl, my mother telling me that, when she was considering naming me, she was considering Joanna and Susanna, right? So women knew, right? Women knew that those women were in there, but it somehow didn't make its way into pulpits in the same way.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Well, that's good input. Any other reactions from folks? Barbara, one thing you mentioned about who John was. When Witherington presented his paper in 2006 to this group of biblical scholars advocating that Lazarus was the beloved disciple and the primary, I think we ought to use a symbol as opposed to, or a source for the fourth gospel. He didn't get any pushback on the premise that Lazarus was the primary source and the beloved disciple, but it led to this wild discussion about who John was.
Mm,
Who's the real to get into that a little bit in the presentation today, but and I think it really also highlights the importance of the three short epistles of John
yes,
that
yes,
most of us, myself included, I've never really spent much time thinking about.
yes, I agree. I thought that was really fascinating too. And it was super helpful, just thinking about the difference between the Galatian cohort and the Judean cohort. And which I had never thought about either, right? And that Mary having had a home in Jerusalem, and being close to Lazarus, and being commended to Lazarus, or Lazarus being commended to her as her son from Jesus on the cross, by Jesus on the cross. Um, Super interesting, just the depth of um, the person, not just the personalities, but the relationships, um, and the perspectives.
Yeah, yeah. And again, getting a bit off topic here, but the other thing that's really struck me is if Lazarus really was the beloved disciple and the primary author, I mean, that's mind-boggling. Just this person saw the cosmic Jesus, experienced things that nobody else did,
Yeah.
and really does put it explain a lot of what's in the fourth gospel, the focus on eternal life and just the much more cosmic and much higher Christology, and it's fascinating stuff. It all hangs together.
And the language. I mean, you need the language of poetry, I would imagine, to describe what he had seen,
Yeah,
right? Prose wasn't going to quite cover it.
yeah,
You
yeah,
needed in the beginning was the word, right?
yeah, yeah. All right, well let's go forward. Any
Yeah, the only time that I have
um
been, can you hear me?
yeah, yeah, go Rosemary.
Okay. I have been with people who have had near-death experiences, and reading about Lazarus, uh, there is a total lack of fear, a total lack, it's like an understanding that's there that I have not met in many people. Um, and that's what fascinates me about him is what you were saying. Um, the only person that I know who actually knew, you know, actually the functional Trinity. The first paragraph of John tells about that. It just fascinates me that, uh, what he did with the rest of his life, because he actually knew. And then it talks about whether or not uh, he would die again. That was interesting too, that part of that.
Yeah. Yeah, Rosemary, apropos what you're saying, a lot of people who criticize the theory that Lazarus was the beloved disciple say, well, why on earth would he then go to Caiaphas's house? Caiaphas had put a hit on him. Well, the man had already died. He's fearless. Uh, or when all the other disciples ran for the hills when Jesus was arrested and crucified, Lazarus wasn't afraid. He 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 had a perspective that showed how temporal everything was that was happening at the time. And um, again, it just really is fascinating stuff. Much more so than I ever really appreciated until I started to delve into this.
Well, and he may also have had I mean, he couldn't help but have had a keen awareness and insight into the movement in monumental historic nature of what was happening, right? I mean, he wouldn't want to be anywhere but next to Jesus during this time,
Yep.
right? I mean,
And I don't think Jesus would want him to be far away either. Lazarus had to understand more of what was going on and why Jesus was letting things happen than the other disciples.
A real trust factor.
Yeah. All right. Well, let me get back to some of the stuff here. A lot of what Witherington does in his book and in his article is deal with the traditional view that John, son of Zebedee, was the author of the fourth gospel. And he points out the fourth gospel never says that. And the superscription, according to John, was probably added about 100 years after the fourth gospel was finally assembled and was circulating. And a lot of it is attributed to the source of a lot of that are some materials that were written late in the second century, again, about 100 years after the fact. And Witherington calls those things external evidence. They are not irrelevant, they're important, uh, but they're not as important as what's in the fourth gospel itself, what he calls internal evidence. And the external evidence is pretty inconsistent or inconclusive or suspect once you really delve down into it. But it's been the prevailing view for a couple thousand years. In any event, Witherington makes the argument, which makes sense to me, that the internal evidence is primary. Secondary, the external evidence is important, but not primary. And a wealth of the internal evidence we've already talked about indicates that John, son of Zebedee, probably was not the author of the fourth gospel. The heavy Judean focus, the absence of any, underscore any, of the events that involve John that are in the synoptics, none of them appear in the fourth gospel. The transfiguration, the raising of Jairus's daughter, the arguments with James and John about who should sit at Jesus' right hand. None of that. And there are a whole bunch more. None of that, as is true for most of the events in Galilee, are in the fourth gospel. It's unlikely that John, son of Zebedee, who was a Galilean fisherman, would be able to host the supper described in John 13. Indeed, if you look at Acts, it indicates there's a session where Caiaphas visits the symbol of the assemblage of the early church in Jerusalem, and it indicates pretty strongly that this is the first time that Caiaphas has ever met John, son of Zebedee. Well, that's inconsistent with the passage in John 18 that indicates that the beloved disciple got access to Caiaphas' courtyard because Caiaphas knew him. That the beloved disciple, i.e., Lazarus, was well known to the high priest and the hierarchy of the Jewish church. It's unlikely that Jesus would have entrusted care of his mother to somebody who lived in Galilee. And chapter 21 of the Gospel according to John, indicates that the Zebedees and the beloved disciples were at the Sea of Tiberias, Sea of Galilee, when Jesus appeared. And that's a strong inference that these are two different people. Acts again indicates that John, son of Zebedee, was not educated. Caiaphas makes a comment about how this was a very plain, simple person without a whole lot of background. That's hard to reconcile with the theologically very sophisticated, just beautiful, as Barbara put it, poetry that one finds in the Gospel according to John. John was a son of thunder, but not the kind of person who would write the beautiful prose that we find in the fourth Gospel. And Jesus had reprimanded John and James. So as a result of all that, most of the real detailed biblical scholars are of the view that John, son of Zebedee, was not the author of the fourth gospel. Richard Bauckham is an incredible biblical scholar. He's written a book called Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, which I commend to you also. Incredibly detailed. It's a long book, but it goes through just enormous detail on all this. And he makes just a compelling case that John, son of Zebedee, was not the author of the fourth gospel. Parenthetically, Bauckham doesn't think Lazarus was either. And he mainly doesn't think Lazarus was because the fourth gospel sometimes uses the word Lazarus and sometimes the beloved disciple. And he thinks that inconsistency is an indication that Lazarus was not the primary author. He instead thinks it's John the Elder, whoever John the Elder was, which we'll get back to in a little bit. But Bauckham does acknowledge that there's a lot of internal evidence that otherwise would indicate that Lazarus is the primary source of the fourth gospel. And in any event, after surveying just all of the scholars, he comes down very strongly that it's pretty much a consensus, a large majority, that it's not John, son of Zebedee, notwithstanding what we were taught in Sunday school and what the church has said officially for years and years. And the internal evidence, we've already covered a lot. But the external evidence has caused scholars, including Ben Witherington, a lot of pause. You just can't ignore it. And I want to go over some of that external evidence over the next few minutes. It's just an obstacle to concluding that Lazarus was the beloved disciple and the author. And indeed, when Witherington wrote John's Wisdom back in 1995, he went through all this compelling internal evidence that Lazarus was the beloved disciple, and according to the fourth gospel itself, the beloved disciple was the primary author. But he was really troubled by all these external sources from the second century that referred to John. So over the following 10 years, he struggled with that, and after delving into it in great detail, concluded that he could reconcile the two. And that's what I want to cover here. And since then, this is a kind of a summary of his conclusion, that Lazarus was the beloved disciple and the primary source, but the final version of the fourth gospel was assembled by somebody named John. And that John was a member of the Johannine community and a follower of Lazarus, for the beloved disciple. And this John assembled the final form based largely on Lazarus's oral teachings. Remember, this was largely an oral history until people started to write down the Gospels in the late first century. And perhaps even there were some written materials prepared by Lazarus. A number of other scholars think that there were rudimentary versions of the fourth gospel, probably written by Lazarus, that existed in 60, 70, 80, before the final version was put together in about 90. And Witherington believes that John was probably John of Patmos, who's also the author of Revelation. And that conclusion reconciles all the external and internal evidence. Again, parenthetically, Raymond Brown, who's one of the other really leading New Testament scholars, author of one of the, I can't remember the name of it, but we have it in the library in Epiphany, a long volume, just goes through the gospel according to John. Raymond Brown evolved his theory, the Anchor Bible series. When he wrote that, he gave a long discussion of how there's a lot of internal evidence pointing to Lazarus, but concluded, based largely on the second century sources, that and church tradition, that John, son of Zebedee, was the author. Well, he changed his mind. He changed his mind again over the following decade, and in 1979, Raymond Brown concluded that these second century sources were just not reliable, and that the author of the fourth gospel had to be a Judean disciple, which is not consistent with John, son of Zebedee. Having said that, though, Brown continued to believe that Lazarus was probably not the author because Lazarus is not discussed in the Synoptics, a topic we talked about a couple of sessions ago. And second, that the fourth gospel refers to Lazarus by name in chapters 11 and 12, and inconsistently, through the balance of it, refers to the beloved disciple as the beloved disciple, or the disciple whom Jesus loved. So let's look at the external evidence. Papias was the bishop of Hierapolis, which is in Turkey. Actually, let me show you see if I can pick this up and show you where Hierapolis is. That's Hierapolis, and that's where Ephesus is. Patmos, by the way, is one of these little islands just off the coast of not Ephesus, Ephesus. I always mispronounce it, Ephesus. And of course, here's where Jerusalem and the Holy Land was. But by the time the fourth gospel was written, the church had really expanded extremely far. And Paul visited Ephesus. Before Paul, Paulus went to Ephesus. So there was a church in Ephesus, a fairly substantial church in Ephesus. And indeed, John Patmos in Revelation writes Revelation addressed to 7 churches, including the church in Ephesus. So anyway, that's just a little orientation. That's where Hierapolis is. And back to the PowerPoint. So anyway, Papias was the bishop of Hierapolis, and that's pretty close to Ephesus. And it's also at the source of the meeting of 2 great roads, including the road from Ephesus to Antioch. So it was pretty much a center for activity in the late 1st century, early 2nd century. And Papias wrote a multi-volume history of the early church. Unfortunately, only a few fragments have survived. And most of them are quoted by Eusebius in his 4th century history of the church. But what we have, again, so Papias is probably the closest in time of any of the sources we have to the writing of the 4th gospel, and also he was close geographically. This is what has survived. He says, if by chance anyone who had been in attendance on the elders, and he's talking there about the 12 and the other people who were really with Jesus, I inquired about them. Andrew, Peter, Philip, blah, 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 or John, or any of the other Lord's disciples. And, so these are another group, whatever Aristion and the elder John, the Lord's disciples, were saying. So as people have really probed that, the probable interpretation of what Papias wrote is that there were 2 different Johns involved in the early church. One, John, son of Zebedee, and another John he calls the elder John. And Papias is pretty clear that he did not meet John, son of Zebedee. Indeed, there's some other sources from Papias and the like that indicate that John, son of Zebedee, had probably died quite a bit earlier. The elder John, on the other hand, was probably alive when Papias was working in Asia Minor, and Papias may well have talked directly to the 2nd John. And Papias also refers to the 2nd John as the elder John, which is the phraseology that's used in the 2nd and 3rd epistles from John. So again, a very interesting, super interesting coincidence or alignment. This is what I mentioned a while ago. An analysis of a fragment from Papias indicates that John, son of Zebedee, probably died quite early as a martyr. His brother James, Acts 12, verse 2, tells us died of a martyr's death quite early on. So again, not definitive, but there's pretty strong evidence that John, son of Zebedee, could not have been the author of the 4th gospel because he wasn't around. He had died. So Ben Wetherington and a bunch of other scholars say that the earliest external evidence does not support the view that John, son of Zebedee, was the author later, but another John who was involved in the early church. Irenaeus was the bishop of Lyon. And he was famous for combating the Gnostics. The Gnostic movement had really gained a lot of weight by the late 2nd century. And writing in about 190 in a book entitled Against Heresies, Irenaeus wrote, "Then John, the disciple of the Lord, the one who leaned back on the Lord's breast, himself published a gospel while he resided in Ephesus. So unpack that. What Irenaeus says is that someone named John was the beloved disciple, because that's the disciple who leaned back on the Lord's breast, and that he published a gospel while he resided in Ephesus. So what Irenaeus is saying is that this John of Zebedee, was the probable disciple who wrote the fourth gospel and also was the beloved disciple. Although you could parse the words, and the word disciple could be much broader than one of the 12.
Yeah.
In any event, it was written about 100 years after the fact. And Irenaeus did not have any firsthand information, and he relied largely on Papias, who we saw a second ago confusingly refers to two different Johns, one of whom is clearly not John, son of Zebedee, and is the only John that Papias actually met. And Irenaeus also relied on Polycarp, one we're going to talk about in just a minute. A key point, when Irenaeus was writing this, Gnosticism and other heretical sects had been founded, and they were really gaining strength. And his main objective, indeed the title of what he wrote, was to rebut the Gnostics and distance the Orthodox Church from those sects. And the Gnostics loved the fourth gospel. And fascinatingly, there is among the Apocrypha some documents that were discovered in Egypt in 1940. The Apocryphon of John. And it was loved by the Gnostics. And I've read it, and it is surreal. It makes Revelation look kind of plain and simple, but it gets off on wild things that we would think were wild and crazy. But parenthetically, this kind of visionary writing was pretty well accepted at the time. Revelation's an example, but Ezekiel, my goodness, I mean, Ezekiel's got all kinds of wild visions that Ezekiel saw, and that's true for a lot of the Old Testament prophets. Anyway, the secret gospel of John was viewed as totally heretical. And there was a lot that was going on at the time that Irenaeus wrote that Irenaeus was trying to rebut. Irenaeus, the theory is, though, however, wanted to make sure that the fourth gospel did not get thrown into the trash can with the other Gnostics' works, that it was really brought into the mainstream and canonized by the church, the official church. And so one of his goals was to ascribe authorship of the fourth gospel to one of the disciples. So in order to rescue the fourth gospel from the Gnostics and give the fourth gospel prominence over the secret gospel of John, which was clearly written in the late 2nd century and not by either of these Johns, Irenaeus argued that the fourth gospel was written by John, son of Zebedee. But he did that based on no firsthand information, and he may have incorrectly assumed that the John to which Papias and Polycarp was referring was John, son of Zebedee, as opposed to an elder John who was in Ephesus at the time the fourth gospel was finalized. Polycarp, who Irenaeus also relied on, was the bishop of Smyrna in Greece. And there's a fragment attributed to Polycarp who said that he was appointed bishop by John, but doesn't identify what John was. Irenaeus's material says he relied in part on the beloved Polycarp. Well, looking back at the history, Irenaeus must have been very young when he learned from Polycarp, so maybe his memory is not perfect. What Irenaeus said is that Polycarp would tell of his conversations with John and others who had seen the Lord. And the early Orthodox Church interpreted that to mean that Polycarp was referring to John, son of Zebedee. But that's probably not correct, because John, son of Zebedee, was probably dead by the time Polycarp was an adult. In any event, it doesn't say that the John with whom Polycarp spoke was John, son of Zebedee. And Polycarp did not say that John wrote the fourth gospel or was the beloved disciple, just that Polycarp learned from someone named John who had seen the Lord. Polycrates, bishop of Ephesus. So at least you got exactly the right city, but this is written again about 100 years after the fact. And Polycrates wrote a letter to Pope Victor, Bishop of Rome. And the context was, what was the correct date of Easter? Remember, there were two different calendars. Deutz preached on this from time to time. The Essene calendar, and then the official uh, ca calendar, I forget which is which. But anyway, there was a lot of debate about that time, and Polycrates, in passing, lists a whole bunch of luminaries from Ephesus who supported his proposed calendar, including John, who leaned back on the Lord's breast, in other words, the beloved disciple, who was a priest wearing the high priestly frontlet, the toe pentalon. That's what the high priest would wear. That was the high priest's signal. And he is fallen asleep at Ephesus. So that's fascinating, and led a lot of these people who got tied up on this second century source material to say the beloved disciple must have been a high priest. And whether or not that's true or not, I mean, who knows? But that was the theory. So Polycrates at least said that the beloved disciple was named John. He doesn't assert that person was the author of the fourth gospel. Claims that he was the high priest, for at least for a time, and says that John was buried in Ephesus. And again, written about 100 years after the fact. And he doesn't give any source, doesn't indicate what his source was. Justin Martyr, the first century philosopher and apologist based in Samaria, spent some time in Ephesus. And he indicates in some of his writings that all of the Gospels were the memoirs of the apostles and those who accompanied them. And there's no specific claim about the authorship of the fourth gospel. And what he says could be interpreted, very easily interpreted, to be broad enough to include Lazarus. And he does indicate that Revelation, for example, was written by John, one of the apostles of Christ. Now, that could mean John, son of Zebedee, could mean John of Patmos. The early Orthodox Church claimed that was evidence that all the Gospels were written by the 12. And leaving aside just the Gospel according to John, that's probably not the view of most biblical scholars about, frankly, any of the Gospels. But that was the Orthodox view that was taken by the church at the time. And maybe Justin Martyr was using the word apostles broadly. In which case, yeah, then it is correct that John Mark or Luke or Lazarus or John of Patmos were apostles in that sense. So it could. Yeah, that was probably more valuable. The computer I was using, I don't know, lost internet connection, so we don't have the PowerPoint slides anymore. But let me try to do what I can from memory here. The kind of the bottom line of all of that second century material is that it's inconclusive, and indeed internally does support Ben Witherington's theory that John of Patmos was the assembler of material that had been either spoken about orally or perhaps written in rough form by Lazarus and done in Ephesus. There are some materials that Witherington talks about from Eusebius also that indicate that John of Patmos was involved in a lot of, well, obviously a lot of the prophet type material that you find in Revelation. And so was this John, who was referred to by Papias as being John the Elder. So this is all internally consistent, and maybe it's convenient that the Witherington assembled it, but I think it's fairly compelling that John of Patmos was one of the leaders of the early Johannine church. He'd been exiled to Patmos until Domitian died, came back. Lazarus was towards the end of his life, and John of Patmos assembled materials that Lazarus had been preaching and teaching and put it together in what became the fourth gospel. Kind of taking it on from there, Witherington also spends more time with the epistles of John than anything else I've seen. The first epistle of John is really a sermon. And if you look at it, it's fascinating in that it is incredibly consistent with the gospel according to John. The gospel according to John has these themes like light and darkness, and you find that throughout the first epistle. The first epistle also starts with a very strong statement that the author of it, incidentally, the epistles also never indicate who wrote them. They never ascribe themselves to John. They're anonymous. But traditionally, the church ascribed them to John. But the first one does start off by saying that it is based upon an eyewitness account. And that is also the kind of thing that one finds throughout the gospel according to John, that the person who is the source was an eyewitness. You find that in John 19, you find that in John 21, that there was an eyewitness. So again, an amazing amount of consistency. First John and Second John in particular, well, Second and Third John are ascribed to John the Elder. And again, Witherington assumes that that is probably John of Patmos, who by the time these were written was a leader of the early church at Ephesus. And First John and Second John epistles spent a lot of time talking about a schism in the early church, particularly based upon a theory that was prominent at the time and grew as the years went by, that Jesus was not human. Jesus was an apparition. Jesus was a spirit that God sent to teach us, that perhaps the spirit of Jesus inhabited the human body of Jesus when Jesus was baptized by John the Baptist, and then left when the crucifixion occurred because a Godhead could not suffer pain and misery and the like. Well, that was a theory that is totally inconsistent with what you find in the Gospel according to John and in the epistles of John. They go on at length about how no, Jesus was in fact both human and divine. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word became God. And you find a lot about became man, and you find a lot in both the Gospel according to John and First John on that topic. So again, that's fascinating that perhaps we ought to pay more attention to the epistles if they were written by Witherington. It's pretty clear that First John, first epistle, was written probably by Lazarus, the beloved disciple. He vacillates on whether or not second and third were written by Lazarus or perhaps John of Patmos, but I'm not sure it makes that much difference. Incidentally, there are some scholars, including Richard Bauckham, who I mentioned before, who thinks that John of Patmos and John the Elder are two different people. Witherington thinks they're the same person. Nobody really knows. Nobody really knows, and I'm not sure it makes that much difference. But those are a couple of theories. I want to change topics now and talk about something that, looking at the recording of the last meeting, which I missed, that you all got into, which is really, really interesting and gets to a theme that Ben Witherington emphasizes that I think is quite important. When the beloved disciple was contacted by Mary Magdalene after Mary Magdalene discovered the tomb was empty, she ran and talked to Peter and the beloved disciple. The beloved disciple ran faster than Peter and got to the tomb first, saw the grave clothes neatly folded up, and believed. And the question is, what did he believe? The common view, the prevailing view, is that he believed that Jesus had been resurrected. Witherington takes a contrary view, and indeed it goes on to say that he believed, even though he did not yet understand the Old Testament scriptures in Hosea and there's one in Psalms, and I forget what the other reference is, that Jesus would, the Messiah would rise again on the third day. They're pretty veiled when you go back and look at them. Some people say, well, that means that you just didn't understand that those were the particular scriptures. Witherington, and believe it or not, Martin Luther and St. Augustine take the position that no, he didn't yet understand that Jesus was resurrected. That instead he thought that his body hadn't been stolen, but he had ascended to God, like Elijah ascended to God, and didn't really understand the resurrection part until He was at the Sea of Galilee in the final chapter of John, where he saw the resurrected Christ. And Witherington thinks that is significant because virtually all of the authors of the Gospels, and indeed of the epistles, saw the resurrected Christ. Paul saw the resurrected Christ in his on the road to Damascus, and saw the resurrected Christ in a number of other visions. And Acts tells us that Jesus, after resurrection, appeared to a multitude of people. I forget the number, 600. So Witherington takes the view that that is the real tie in what's in the New Testament. These people saw the resurrected Christ, and that's significant. And it brought home something to me that I didn't fully understand when I first started getting into this. There is a difference, according to theologians, between being raised from the dead, i.e. Lazarus, and being resurrected. When Lazarus was raised from the dead by Jesus, Lazarus came out of the tomb wearing his grave clothes and had to be helped out of them by his friends, people who were there. He needed help. He needed assistance, as we all do, as we all really do. Jesus, on the other hand, and Lazarus needed his grave clothes again because he was raised from the dead, but he was still in a mortal body that ultimately died, which did apparently in about 90 AD. That's different than Jesus. When Jesus was resurrected, Jesus, that was eternal. Jesus appeared, but ascended. And it wasn't like Jesus was going to die again. And there's a distinction that theologians use. And I think in the first session referred to Lazarus being resurrected. That's probably a normal way that you would think of it, but the theologians draw a real difference, draw a distinction that Lazarus saw the cosmic Jesus, saw the other side, probably wasn't happy about being brought back to an earthly existence, but he had an earthly existence. He was immortal. Jesus was both human and divine. And that's a real distinction. That's a real distinction and something that I had not really fully appreciated before. They were pretty close to the end of time.